Chicky with today's historical fiction podcast interview. My guest today is Antoine Vanner, the author of 9 historical fiction books in the Dawlish Chronicles series, which tells the story of Admiral Sir Nicholas Dawlish, who is best remembered today for leaving retirement in 1914 at the request of his friend and sometime rival, Lord Fisher, to assume responsibility for unconventional naval operations. His imaginative filling of that role and his death at the age of 72 on the Gettysburg Mole, where he fell in a hail of machine gun fire on St. George's Day, 1918, making him the oldest serving officer to fall in action in either World War, ending an illustrious career in a manner which he would have found wholly appropriate. Our guest, Antoine Vanner, has been writing off and on for many years, but as his business career took off, he had to cut back. The impulse to get going again, seriously so, came just before retirement from full-time work when he attended a lecture and book signing session by the late naval novelist Douglas Reman at a local bookshop. In a calm, dignified, and erudite way, Reman conveyed not only vast knowledge and enthusiasm for his subject, but the importance of a methodical approach to writing. He provided the inspiration for taking the task really seriously, and since then Antoine has adopted the Latin motto, Nulla des sine linea, not a day without a line. So thank you, Douglas Reman. Antoine's adventurous career in international business gave him the opportunity to live and work in 8 countries, as well as shorter assignments in a dozen more. He is bilingual in English and Dutch, adequate in Spanish, abysmal in German, and his smatterings in 2 other languages so rusty as to not be worth mentioning. He currently lives in Britain with his wife, dog, and 7 horses. Antoine's fiction reflects deep knowledge of all political, military, and social history of the 19th century, as well as of the cutting-edge technologies of the period. His plots are linked to real events and real characters, often in settings in which he has direct personal experience. Moral ambiguity is a major theme in his work, and his protagonists, Nicholas Dawlish, R.N., and his indomitable wife, Florence, are confronted by difficult ethical choices as they balance ambition and conscience. In preparing for this interview, I perused Mr. Vanner's website at www.dawlishchronicles.com, and I really loved his article, Getting into the Victorian Mind. A great read for anyone daring to attempt a historical novel in any era. I highly recommend the read. In his article, he states, I believe that the greatest single challenge in writing historical fiction is not getting dates, physical details of ships or weapons, forms of speech or linkages to real events right, but in getting into the minds of the characters. This means that they should think and feel as people in that period would have done, and that they should not be 21st century people in reenactors' dress. This is so true, and I hope to expound on this during the interview. Mr. Vanner, I am so thrilled to have you on the show today. To start off with, I'd love to know more about your adventurous ramblings and travels. Can you tell us about any literary pilgrimages you have made?
It's not so much a single pilgrimage as an association that has lasted over very many years with the great English novelist Jane Austen. I'd first read her when I was a boy, and I've read the books several times since, always delighting in the wit and the elegance of her prose and the wry observation of the society of her time. For many years I owned a house quite near the Hampshire village of Chawton, where she lived in her later years with her sister and her mother, and that has been transformed into a museum that gives a very good impression of what their daily life must have been. But also in the area you can walk over beautiful countryside, following routes that she herself mentions having followed in her journals. Close by is the city of Winchester, and you can find her grave in the cathedral there, and also the house where she spent her own last sad months of illness. But also at Chawton is the Knight estate, a quite enormous estate which Jane's brother Henry inherited from a rich and childless uncle on the condition that he changed his name from Austen to Knight. There's a large manor house. There's a working farm there today. And in the grounds is the church, in the graveyard of which Jane's mother and sister, both called Cassandra, are buried. It was therefore rather appropriate, then, in view of this sort of feel for the life of Jane Austen, that when my wife and I held our wedding reception, we should do so in the manor house, which you can actually rent for the day or so on for functions.
That's awesome.
And so for that reason, it also has a very, very strong and lasting significance for us.
Oh, of course. And you know what? The moment you said the name Jane Austen and your love for her and her works, I was hooked. And that you and your wife held your wedding reception in the manor house there is astounding and incredibly romantic. That is amazing. I'd love to talk with you more on this, but let me ask you first, as an established author, what is the best writing tip you can give to young writers just starting out?
I think the best writing tip is that which was given by the great Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope, who said in Latin, nulla dies sine linea, not a day without a line. And he lived up to that. He was a man who was very, very highly travelled all over the world. But no matter where he was, whether at home or in a hotel or in a ship or a train, he always managed to produce. I think it's a good lesson for all of us. We may not be able to write 7 days a week, but I think we should be able to certainly make 5 or 6. And in each of those days, we must set ourselves a target, and we must meet it. And whether that target is 200 words a day or 2,000 or anything in between, what matters is that you reach it. You continue to deliver, and you know that at the very end of the process, you are going to have written a book. You know you can do it, and you know you can do it again and again and again.
That's so very true. And you said the Latin line so much more eloquently than I ever could. That is great advice, and I'm sure you have tons more tips for writers, such as what do you think are some of the common traps that aspiring writers fall into?
I think the most common trap is starting writing too soon. Starting in chapter 1 without having a sufficiently good idea as to how the flow of action will go, spread out over the timescale that is covered in the novel. If you're in this situation, then there's a good chance you're going to get bogged down quite soon. You're probably going to get demoralized, and in the worst case, you're possibly even just give up, throw in the towel. My own writing motto is to plan the work, work the plan. And that means spending a significant amount of time beforehand on the researching, on developing the plot, on developing the individual main characters, and then noting down the entire sequence of action. I tend to summarize that in a series of bullet points, typically 5 or 6 pages of them, which tell in very abbreviated form what the story is. It's rather like the storyboarding process that is carried out in the making movies. Once you have all that, you can divide it down into chapters, and you could be in a position to start. Probably not, however. It's probably necessary to go back over it with a very, very critical eye, maybe not once or twice, but many more times, 5 or 6 times, tightening up at each time, identifying weaknesses, and really getting as tight a plot as you can before you actually start the process of writing. This approach is not necessarily a straitjacket. You don't have to stick to that original plan rigidly, because as one writes, then the momentum of the story will expose weaknesses in your original thinking, or it will expose opportunities which you did not identify initially. And as characters develop, then you find some may be weaker or some may be stronger than you thought. The relationships may change, there may be opportunities there as well, and they take on a life of their own.
Yes.
In that case, it's necessary to go back, to modify your plot, modify your plan accordingly, so that you know again once where are you going, how you are going to get to the end point, how you're going to stay on track, how you're going to get back on track if you're deflected in any way. And you know that in the process, you'll finally reach that magic moment when you can write the words, "the end."
Yes. Thank you so much for showing the work that goes into a story. But I'm sure there was a day when you were still learning yourself. So can you tell us, if you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would that be? I'm sure that whatever you have to tell us would really help younger writers out there.
Advice to my younger self? Well, that's quite a difficult one. I think it would have been to have spent much more time and effort on developing what I now call my internal cinema, my mental cinema, that allows me to not just visualize, but indeed feel the action from the viewpoint of a specific protagonist. That means feeling the emotions of elation, fear, love, disappointment, anger, or certainty that may be inherent in the situation. And also the physical environment, the hot or the cold or the wet, the noise or the smell, or the hunger or thirst, and then the exhaustion and illness, and the uncertainty about what's going to happen. Nowadays, I tend to create these cinema sequences in my head when I'm walking in the afternoon, such when I start writing the next morning, the process is going to be one of describing a scene which I've actually experienced and is real to me. It lives.
Well, that's really amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And you know, I'm truly an advocate for writers groups and critique groups, or having author friends who can help you edit or just bounce ideas off of each other. So what other authors are you friends with, and how do they help you become a better writer?
For me, the association I have with my fellow members of the Old Salt Press is particularly valuable. The Old Salt Press is an independent group that caters to people who like books about the sea and ships in the sea. And we'd like to think that we're working together to produce some of the best nautical and maritime fiction and non-fiction. We've got writers in the United States, particularly Rick Spillman, Linda Collison, V.E. Hewlett. We've got Seymour Hamilton in Canada. We've got Alaric Bond here in the UK. And we've got Joan Druett in New Zealand, who, in addition to our novels, writes meticulously researched maritime history. We're extremely, I think, useful to each other in terms of sharing experience in relation to publishing, reviewing each other's work, helping with beta reading, which is an important process for any writer, and in general, keeping each other moving. So for me, that's invaluable. But also of importance, I found, was my membership of the Historical Novelists Association, through whom I've met a lot of really wonderful people. When we get together, we tend to knock sparks off each other. It's quite an inspiring process. And two authors I'd mention in particular. One is Alison Morton, who writes really superb, not historical novels so much as alternate universe novels, set in a world that is internally consistent, but not completely the same as our own. And the other is Tom Williams, who writes really excellent military and espionage fiction set in the Napoleonic era and the early Victorian period. So all these people I've mentioned, and very, very many more, in fact, that I've no time to mention here, have been very valuable to me. And I'd recommend that anybody who is starting out writing fiction to try to make such contacts early on, because you'll certainly help each other and find the process exceptionally helpful.
Yes, it truly is, and I'm glad that you said that, because some of the connections that I've made early on in my writing career, some of the retreats that I've been to, I still keep in touch with them. They are mentors and friends and keep me on my toes with my writing, and it definitely is something a younger writer needs to do, to find a critique group and allow that support to move them towards becoming a better writer. So Antoine, can you give us a quick review of one of your favorite books by one of your author friends?
Well, rather than a single book, I'd prefer to mention a series by Alaric Bond, who's a fellow member of the Old Salt Press. Alaric's published 16 novels, all but 2 of them in his Fighting Sail series, which is set in the Napoleonic era. Unlike most other authors writing in the naval fiction genre, including myself, he does not have 1 or 2 main protagonists. He features characters from all ranks and stations aboard ship. They recur through his novels, and depending on the plot, their roles may be greater or lesser than in previous books. This approach gives a realistic impression of what life on a sailing warship must have been, because it sees it not just through the eyes of officers, which is normal in such fiction, but rather also by those of the men of the lower deck. More recently, Alaric's just started a new series that features coastal forces in World War II, and I think this promises to be equally fascinating.
Well, thank you for that. Well, Antoine, my next question for you is, how did publishing your first book change your process of writing, or did it at all?
When I published my first book, I had planned to write an entire series, and I had the overall concept for that. So I waited until I had the first and second books essentially ready for publication. I revised the hell out of them, and then I also had the third book well advanced. I published the first book, and I found relatively little response, although I had, taken a lot of measures to publicize it. So 2 months later, I published the second novel, and suddenly sales took off. And I realized then that if you're writing a series, one of the lessons is that the second book sells the first, and that thereafter the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth books sell the books that follow. So I think that's important. If you are writing a series, I think it's important to get that second book out quickly, because you let people know that you're not a one-shot wonder.
Right.
You're not somebody who is, who's been working for years to produce one novel and may not be producing another one for God knows how long. And people respond to that. So for me, then the sales took off after the second, and I've never really looked back after that point. If you haven't got a whole series in mind, and I was thinking of certainly well over 10 books, if you haven't got a series in mind, I think it's probably worthwhile thinking in not less than a trilogy, not less than 3 books, and to plan the strategy for your writing and for publishing accordingly.
That really helps me, because even though I started out with what I called my Fractured Shakespeare series, I'm still planning on eventually having each play transformed into a historical novel. I've kind of taken a different turn with my new series, a historical time travel series. So that really helps me. Thank you for saying that, because it's kind of helped me get an idea of how I need to set about with my 3 novels for this next series. Well, let me ask you this. What is the best money you have ever spent as a writer? I love this question because it really helps young writers, well, not just young writers, it helps any writers get an idea of what might be the best way to spend your money on your novels.
I think in terms of return on investment, I think the best money I ever spent to support my writing was buying a book called Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Rennie Brown and Dave King. It originally appeared in the 1990s. It's been revised a few times since, I think. And it's extremely pragmatic in the advice it gives you in terms of really sharpening up your writing. I make particular use of it when I'm revising the first and second drafts of a novel, which is the time when I've got to make the most significant changes and modifications. But it's got an additional advantage as well, in that it helps you sharpen up your writing style so that as you use it over the years, you learn how to preempt the sort of problems that you were particularly prone to during your early writing. It's also got a great advantage that it has exercises at the end of each chapter. It provides paragraphs which it asks you to modify or to change in relation to the lessons given in the previous chapter. So you learn very well when you're using it. I think it's absolutely essential for any writer to have on their desk. And I give the name again, Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Rennie Brown and Dave King.
Okay. You know what? I just wrote the name of that book down as you were saying it, and it is going in my Amazon cart tonight. I do have some books like that as well that I use. I love Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott and On Writing by Stephen King. I think those are some excellent books on writing as well. Now, Antoine, we are up to my favorite question in the interview. I love hearing the different stories from authors and how linked we all are in similarities. Tell us, what was an early experience where you learned that language had power?
Well, even after 60 years, I remember this particular moment very clearly indeed. I was a boy, and I saw on the television a screening of the 1930s Hollywood movie, Ruggles of Red Gap, in which Charles Laughton plays a British butler who finds himself rather incongruously in the late 19th century United States. It's a comedy, and a rather silly one by modern standards. But a moment comes when the mood changes, when Laughton declaims the Gettysburg Address, surprising his hearers and reminding them of the value of freedom. It was the first time that I heard it, and I was profoundly moved. It seemed to me to embody all that seemed noble and worthwhile in life. It seemed to me to embody all that humanity should aspire to do and be. For me, it started a lifelong admiration of Lincoln and a fascination with the American Civil War. So in later years, I followed most of the major campaigns and the battles on the ground. For me, later, standing at Gettysburg, on the spot where Lincoln spoke his few inspiring words, were for me probably one of the most moving experiences of my life. As was said of Churchill, Lincoln mobilized the English language and sent it into battle for the cause of freedom. I believe that the address will live on to inspire countless generations in the centuries to come and inspire them with the ideal of freedom.
That's very true, and what a profound experience for a young boy. I think many people feel that way about Lincoln and about Churchill. Such incredible and inspiring words. I'm going to let your statement sort of sink in for a moment. And since it touches on a sort of spiritual experience, can you tell me if you view writing as a spiritual practice?
Well, I don't know if spiritual is actually the word, but I certainly think there's significant value in immersing oneself in another time and place and thinking through the significance of that. I'm not a fan of the pure action or pure adventure novel with an exciting crisis at the beginning and the middle and the end and little more. And obviously I need to have these in my books, I rather like having them. But running in parallel, I also want to pose issues of moral ambiguity and dilemmas that challenge the protagonist's integrity. And these can include conflicts of loyalty or how one should behave when having signed up on the basis of one's honour to something one finds to be unworthy and to be a bad cause thereafter, or making deals with unworthy or even despicable people, or when it's necessary to take a stand regardless of the consequences for life or for career. I've been influenced this by one of my great heroes, which is Joseph Conrad, whose books have all these features, usually cracking stories in terms of the action and the plot, but also that examination of morality. And I don't think any writer conveys better the dreadfulness of large-scale evil, but also talks about the squalid sort of compromises that demean the human spirit. I've put my main protagonist and his wife in such situations quite frequently. In fact, she's had a harder time, but I think in some ways than he had. And that happens throughout the series. And in the process, I've seen them mature. So it's very satisfying for me to see that, by the time they get into book number 9 or number 10, as I'm writing at the moment, that they're rather better people than they were in book number 1.
Well, with all of this being said about the depth of words and the power of books, is there anything you have read that made you think differently about fiction? I know you just mentioned another author, but can you kind of expound on that for us?
My realization that good writing can change one's life and one's values was borne out for me by the spectacularly good novel Destiny of Fire by the wonderful French novelist Zoe Oldenburg. It deals with the Albigensian crusade of the 13th century and the destruction, the extermination of the Cathars, the Albigensians, in southwestern France. It deals with all the things that are of value, things like courage, loyalty, belief, love, and it deals with them in a way that touches you in your very core. And in my case, something very remarkable happened, because about 2 months after I read the book, I was exposed to something in Africa which was as dreadful in its details and the way in which people behaved in relation to it, as she portrays in the book. It moved me very, very deeply and confronted me with the fact that nothing is more important than the value of human life. And although that moment came almost 50 years ago, it's changed my entire perception of what is valuable and what is not. So yes, Zoe Oldenburg changed my life.
Oh, that's so profound, and I just can't even say any more about that. But please let me ask you this. What do you think are the ethics about writing about historical figures? In your case, what ethics did you adhere to when writing about Dawlish?
I think one must be very careful when introducing real-life historical characters into plots. I do it myself on quite a number of occasions, but I've always chosen that they would be not the main protagonist, but essential to the plot, and the main protagonist interacts with them. I've had quite a range, from the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, also known as Abdul the Damned, the amazing Hobart Pasha, who was a British naval officer who ran the blockade for the Southern Confederacy and the American Civil War, and who ended up as the head of the Ottoman Turkish Navy. And a particular favourite of mine, the Victorian hero, General Gordon. And there was also a lot of fun in introducing Adam Worth, also known as Henry Judson Raymond, who was an American king of crime, who set himself up as a respected socialite in Britain, a friend of the Prince of Wales, while maintaining a massively successful criminal career and becoming known to Scotland Yard as the Napoleon of crime. But in all these cases, whether they're good or bad characters in terms of moral worth and ethical worth, I think the novelist must do justice to them in terms of ensuring that they're not shown as behaving or thinking in a way which they would not have done in real life. Even to the worst of them, I think one owes that much.
Yes, I agree. Well, you know what? I'm going to kind of switch up a little bit in the questions. Can you tell us what has been the best way you have found to market your books?
I am very impressed by the ability that Amazon gives to market to a global readership. And in addition to that, the ability to publish not only in hard copy, but in Kindle as well. And Kindle sales can be very significant. Readers can read your work not only in a Kindle device, but also on a smartphone or in a tablet at any time. Yeah? And getting back to that global spread, I've been surprised by just how widely my books get read. Not only in the obvious markets like the United States and the United Kingdom, but in Australia and Canada and New Zealand and other English-speaking countries. But also I tend to get sales in European countries as well, where I suppose on many occasions people have not got reading in a language which is not their first language. And on very few occasions I actually manage also to sell a book or two in Japan. Mm-hmm. I think the other major advantage of Amazon is the review system, because it allows potential buyers, potential readers, to see what others have thought of the book and to make their decision accordingly. And the reviews also give very, very, very valuable feedback to the writer themselves.
Yes, I agree. It's interesting that you said that about Japan, because I just recently got a review and I had to translate it because the entire review is in Japanese. It was a good review, thankfully. But yes, I'm with you. I'm astounded at the reach that you're able to get with Amazon. Excuse me. So let me ask you this. Talking about reviews, do you read your book reviews, and how do you deal with the bad ones or the good ones?
Yes, I read all my reviews, and I'm invariably very grateful for them. I'm lucky that I'm scoring on average 4.5, 4.5 out of 5 stars on my Amazon reviews. And I find that the vast majority either confirm that they enjoyed the book, which I always like to hear, or offer on occasion constructive criticism. And I find that particularly valuable, because I may even on occasions go back and modify manuscript of a previous novel very slightly to take account of it for correction on the Kindle version or the paperback version. And it may help me quite a bit in relation to the plotting and the writing of the latest novel on which I'm working. Yeah. There are occasions, however, when there's maybe 1% of the time you come across a review that is, I think the only word I can use is malignant. Probably coming in with somebody who's pretty twisted and bitter in in general, and they like to give you a 1 or a 2 or something here. And the main reason quoted very often is that my characters, who are Victorians, don't hold with the same type of behaviors and ethics and outlook of people have in the 21st century. Well, those people need reminding that I'm writing historical fiction, not current fiction. Right. And frankly, I don't lose much sleep over them. But I'm certainly grateful for the positive and constructive criticism that I do receive. It's highly appreciated. Right.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I received a 1-star review for my first novel, and at first I was pretty devastated about it, but then after I reread it again, I realized that it was from somebody who was so adamantly a Shakespearean advocate. My novel was about Marlowe possibly being the author of the plays. But I'm not a historian. I am a historical fiction author, and I presented it as a historical alternative. But he gave me a 1-star review simply for the fact that he was a Shakespearean advocate. So I moved on from that. And you have to do that. Well, let me ask you this. What do you think is the most difficult part of your artistic process?
Yeah, for me, the greatest challenge is writing the first half of the first draft of any book. It's quite a slow process. You've got to start that, the very first chapter, with some dramatic scene or dramatic incidents that grab the attention of the reader and introduce them to the situation and to the characters. And from that moment on, they've got to be asking themselves, do I care about these people? And what happens next. And in those early chapters that follow on after that, you've got to start ramping up the tension in the story. But you've also got to work in quite a lot of information in relation to the background, the context, background to the individual, and quite a lot of other information. And if you try to pack all that into a single chapter, then you're going to get something that is totally indigestible for the reader, and you're going to turn them off. So you've got to space that out over that first half. I feel that by the time I've done that, and I'm reaching the central crisis of the book, in other words, the one halfway, by the time I get to that, I feel the worst is over. I'm over the hump, and from then on, the adrenaline really starts to flow for me as a writer, and I speed up quite a bit in the second part of the book. The momentum takes over, and I really enjoy that bit. But that first half, that can be very hard going.
Yes, it is. Starting out and getting things set up is very much a challenge. Well, let me ask you this. What kind of research did you do for this book? And how long do you usually spend researching before beginning a book?
Research. Well, I see there are three essential categories, and I'll take them in turn. And the first, and arguably the most important, is having a thorough appreciation of the history of the period one wants to write about. This isn't just about knowing about events and the major figures of the time, but having an understanding, a feeling for the values and the thinking, and having a familiarity with the political, cultural, social, scientific and technological aspects and trends. Getting this really is a work of years, a labour of love in fact, but without it one wouldn't really want to start writing about a specific period. If you don't have that, I think you end up portraying 21st century characters with 21st century outlooks and values who are rigged out in reenactment costumes and dumped incredibly in the past. The second category of research relates directly to the plot of the book now being undertaken. A knowledge of the real-life events that it's set against, the implications those might have on the large, say, national scale or for individuals, the scale of the activity, and details like location or climate or seasons, clothing, weapons, travel methods, travel times. And all this is needed if the novel's action is to dovetail credibly with the actual events. For me, the third kind of research is that which I do on the fly. It's actually the easiest. It can be done during the writing. It's details like what day of the week did a certain date fall upon, or what was the phase of the moon on that particular night, or at what date was a certain place linked to the outside world by telegraph. Google searches, and especially Google Earth in fact, are a godsend for this type of research. As regards time, my novels are almost invariably around 120,000 words, and from beginning of the plotting process right through to publication, which really starts off with that second level of research. The total time is about 1,200 hours, and of that, somewhere between 100 and 150, possibly even 200 hours will be spent on that more detailed research. And without that, I would not want to start.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, now, can you tell us a bit about your novels, about your entire series, and why particularly you wrote about this topic?
My series, the Dawlish Chronicles, deals with the lives of a Victorian naval officer and his wife. They're both born around the middle of the 19th century, and they live on well into the 20th. It's a time of very significant change. Cultural, political, social, scientific, technological. It's a time also when there's major change on the international front. Balances of power are shifting. Established empires are going to decline, and new players like Japan and Imperial Germany and the United States are rising. There are few direct confrontations between the great powers in that time, but their rivalries are played out very often on the peripheries or by proxies, and that features in some of the stories. It's also difficult for them challenging rather for them at a personal level. Dawlish, the hero, he himself joins the Royal Navy in 1858 at the age of 13, and is still commanded by men who've served in the Napoleonic Wars and who are masters of the age of fighting sail. But he will have to cope with the introduction of steel ships, turbines, large caliber guns, torpedoes, and later on radios, submarines, and aircraft. His wife too has got to cope with challenges on the social front when she confronts a number of serious abuses within British society. So it's a time of major challenge. And why is it interesting to me? Well, I think because for me and for my generation, whose grandparents were born and in some cases came to maturity before the end of the 19th century, that period feels like the day before yesterday, because they told us about them and we got a feel for it. And for me, the changes they lived through, the changes they had to accommodate to, represented for me a very attractive period to set my fiction in and to confront the sort of dilemmas that people faced in those years.
Well, I have a really unique question for you. What is your favorite line or passage from your own book?
One of the happiest periods of my life was when I lived and worked in Turkey and came to admire so much the Turkish people for their courage, their steadfastness, and their loyalty. It wasn't surprising, therefore, that the first book I published should be set in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, when a British officer is seconded to the Turkish forces. So this brief scene is in the early morning. He's waking up in the middle of a snowfield where they've had to spend the night. It's pretty grim. So it reads, "But then the sight of a man stirring uncomfortably beneath his blanket of snow moved him. It might have been Buland, or Alper, or Adnan, men whom he'd never seen until recently and who shared little with him in belief or culture, but whose fidelity was unquestioning, whose endurance was uncomplaining. It was to them he now owed allegiance, and he knew that he could not bear to cast it aside until this war was ended. One way or the other, until then, he was a Turk."
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. And I have relatives right now that are living in Turkey, and they have said the same thing. They love it there, and they've just immersed themselves into the getting to know the people, and so I can understand just from what they have told me about what you experienced. Well, let me ask you this. Since you've told us what your favorite line or passage was, can you also tell us what the hardest scene was for you to write?
The hardest scene I ever had to write was one which involved the death of a main character. He was one I was very fond of. He was flawed in many ways, but he was courageous, he was generous, he had a vision, and he was the sort of individual that you really like to know in real life. But for the purpose of the plot, he had to go. I shrunk from the act, and I went out that night before I would even write, and I walked around in the dark for about 2 or 2.5 hours debating with myself if there was any possible way that I could rejig the plot to spare him. And very reluctantly, I came to the decision that no, I couldn't. He'd have to go. He'd have to go for the high jump. Because it was essential for the strength of the plot. I gritted my teeth, I came home, and I did away with them. But it was very painful. In general, I don't kill off characters if I can help it, especially if they're strong characters, whether they're strong positively or negatively, whether I like them a lot or whether I loathe them, because I do like very often to bring them back in later novels, as happens, of course, in the course of your own life, when there are people that you meet again and again, perhaps in different circumstances.
Right. So you only kill when necessary, unlike George R.R. Martin. Right. We're at the end of the interview, and I have enjoyed having you here on the show so very much. And I always like to end the interviews with, can you tell us your favorite quote and how the quote tells us something about you?
Well, this quote is quite a long one and is taken from a much longer speech, but I'm going to crave your indulgence by reading a reasonably long quote from it. This is one I think that has got great significance for us as writers, and I'll come back to that at the end here. It's from the speech given by William Faulkner when he accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. And for me, the most important words he spoke then were as follow: I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet's, the writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honour and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man, it can be one of the props, the pillars that help him endure and prevail. Now for me, Antoine Vanner, I think the most important thing here is that what he calls the duty of the writer. And for all of us, whether we're writing great literature that will last for centuries, like Faulkner wrote, or whether it's somebody in a much more humble line of business like I am, who is writing entertainments, I think we need to bear this one in mind. For me, Faulkner's quote here is one that is absolutely inspirational to me as a writer.
Mr. Vanner, your words and the passion behind quoting this from Faulkner truly gives us writers a vision of the power of words. I am truly humbled by your interview, and I am excited to read your novels in the very near future. For my listeners today, please let's give Mr. Antoine Vanner a standing ovation for his commanding and eloquent locution during today's interview. And for those wishing to delve into his works, you can click on the link in the episode description, which will take you to his website at www.dawlishchronicles.com. That is www.dawlishchronicles.com. Or you can visit his Amazon author page and start out with Book 1, Britannia's Innocence, in the series. Once again, thank you, Mr. Vanner, for joining me today. This is D.K. Marley, the Hisfig Chickie. Go out and escape to another world within the pages of a historical fiction novel, and I'll see you next time on the show.